Hi, welcome back. I'm Blaise Hope for Berita Satu at the World Economic Forum with John Riady, co-chair of this year's meeting and executive director of the Lippo Group. Innovation. We mentioned this before the break. How crucial is that to Indonesia's economy growing?
Very crucial. Traditional economic development has always told us that countries have to move from an agricultural-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy and then to an innovation-based economy. I think in today's world, we cannot afford to have those phases. I think no matter which phase you are or any country is at, innovation must become the foundation of economic growth. So I think it's very important. And I think for Indonesia, traditionally, we've been very reliant on a lot of natural resources and things like that, manufacturing. But I think slowly, as the workforce becomes more ready, as businesses gear up, and as necessity calls for, we'll become more innovative.
Is innovation as important to entrepreneurship here, or is it just a question of encouraging people to be entrepreneurs?
I think innovation and entrepreneurship are inevitably linked. I think they're one and the same thing. I think you cannot have innovation without a culture of entrepreneurship. And I think when you talk about innovation, when you talk about entrepreneurship, it's not only in the business sector. It's also, we also need entrepreneurship in the public sector. We need innovative policies that will work. We need also entrepreneurship in academia. Right? We can't continue to do the same thing again and again. So I think at the heart of entrepreneurship is a mentality of innovation, is a mentality that will continue to try to find new things, to reinvent the wheel, to find new solutions to old problems, and to be able to have better outcomes.
How can we cultivate that sense of entrepreneurship?
I think it's a culture. We need to allow and embrace failure. We need to celebrate success, but also see failure as a pathway to that, which I think in many more Eastern Asian cultures perhaps it's not as encouraged. So I think it requires a change in mindset. It requires a reformation in education system. It requires also examples. So I think we've got some great entrepreneurs and innovators in business and in the public sector. So we need to promote them, and we need them to be an inspiration for everyone else.
Would you say that that view reflects the mental revolution called for by Joko Widodo?
I think so. I think what Pak Jokowi, our president, has called for, revolusi mental, I think part of that, or an important part of that, is this whole idea of entrepreneurship. Right? We cannot continue to do the same things again and again as we've been doing it over the last 50 years. We need new approaches, a new mindset, an open mindset. So yes.
Do you think openness to other countries around the world and openness to people coming is an important part of this? There's a lot of nationalist rhetoric. Would you speak against that?
I would. I think a lot of the nationalist rhetoric, I think it's important to be patriotic, to love your country, but I think some of the nationalistic sentiments we have heard, I think are counterproductive, and I think are a symptom of a deeper, if I may use the word, sense of insecurity, which I think doesn't have to be the case. Indonesia is a rich country. We have many able citizens. We can compete, and I think, the funny thing is, when you talk about globalization, almost every country is worried about globalization, right? Almost no country, I think, sort of openly says, I want to open up. But it cannot be that globalization is bad for everyone, right? And yet, every country is somewhat pessimistic about globalization. We're worried that Chinese goods, we're worried that when we open up, Singaporean companies will come and flood our country. And yet Singapore is also worried that if they open up, that they can't quite manage the openness of the region. So I think the answer is that openness and regionalism will benefit everyone. We need to slowly change the mindset of the region.
So with the ASEAN Economic Community starting at the end of this year, what do you think are the biggest changes we're going to see in the short term?
Well, I think we have to remember that the integration of our region began in the 1970s with the founding of ASEAN. So, which means it's been a 30, 40-year process. And I think there'll be another 30, 40 years before we become that region. So I personally, I think that AEC in 2015 is an important milestone, but that in and of itself doesn't mean that things will change overnight. I think the change will be gradual. I think the change will be incremental, and that's consistent with how it has been and consistent with sort of the ASEAN way of doing things.
Do you think that people here at the World Economic Forum have been addressing that, or has it been sidelined by issues like the rupiah and how to deal with that?
Well, I think we've been discussing both issues. You know, the theme of this meeting is trust and in East Asia's regionalism, right? So I think the whole idea of regionalism of the ASEAN economic community has been a central point of discussion. At the same time, you know, we are living, as the meeting is going on, there are very important developments going on around the world with regard to China slowing down, with regard to the federal bank policy in the US. So they're also having to address those issues at the same time.
Do you see something like the level of integration with the European Union? Do you see Southeast Asia being able to reflect that?
I think we'll have our own definition of integration. I think what may have worked in Europe, the EU that is, may not work here. I think there is a consensus, for example, that we don't want a monetary union, we don't want a single currency, which I think is probably right. So I think integration is important. We all want integration. It's a question of how and to what extent.
Would you argue, as some would, that the degree of that is just a cultural difference?
I think there's certainly a cultural difference between our countries. I would also argue that many of the ASEAN countries are at very different points in its economic development. Singapore is at what, $42,000 per capita GDP. Myanmar is at 800. Indonesia is at 3,500. So there's economic differences, cultural differences, historical differences, political differences, linguistic differences. So there are many differences, and that's why I think the integration of our region will happen gradually.
What do you think will maybe be the most interesting things to watch in Indonesia in the coming years, especially with regard to linking with ASEAN?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see the role that Indonesia can play as a leader in the region. If you take a look at history under Suharto, Indonesia has always been a leader, a champion of the region. This week we're also celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Asia-Africa Conference. That was a conference in Bandung in 1955 when Indonesia played a leadership role in organizing the emerging markets and gave them a collective voice on issues that were hitherto dominated by Western powers. So that has always been Indonesia's DNA. We've always been a leader in the region. So I'd be interested to see over the next few years how Indonesia can continue to play that role and how it can continue to play a stronger role in organizing the region and creating a new sort of global order.
Okay, well, we'll touch back on that in just a minute. We've got to go to break, but stay with us.